Hi, everybody. Carolyn Moneymaker back again. Since we're using a new platform, we're having some technical difficulties, but I'm pleased to tell you that we have Dr. Paul Offit here. I am thrilled to have him speak for several reasons. One, as a pediatrician, he's been one of my heroes for a long time. Um, and as he pointed out to me, his wife is from Virginia. So he has a nice feel for our coalition as well. He's the director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the recipient of many awards, including the J. Edmund Bradley Prize for Excellence in Pediatrics from the University of Maryland Medical School, the Young Investigator Award in Vaccine Development from the Infectious Disease Society of America, and a Research Center Career Development Award from the National Institute of Health. Dr. Offit has published more than 160 papers in medical and scientific journals in the areas of rotavirus-specific immune responses and vaccine safety. He is also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq, which he has been recognized through multiple awards. In 2009, Dr. Offit received the President's Certificate for Outstanding Service from the American Academy of Pediatrics. In 2011, he received the Humanitarian of the Year Award from the Biologics Industry Organization, BIO, the David E. Rogers Award from the American Association of Medical Colleges, the Odyssey Award from the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, and was elected to the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences. Since that time, his work has been recognized through numerous awards, including the Edward Jenner Lifetime Achievement Award in Vaccinology from the 15th Vaccine Congress, and he was elected to the Baltimore Jewish Hall of Fame. Dr. Offit is, as everyone knows, on the advisory committee on immunization practices to the CDC, or called ACIP, and he is currently a member of the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee and is a founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and Foundation for Vaccine Research. And he is the author of at least 10 medical narratives. So, Dr. Offit, we appreciate you taking time from all of your COVID work, and we are so excited to have you. So welcome to the stage.
All right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. We're going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and stopping it so that we can get back to our lives. All right, let's use this as a way to advance. Okay, so the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, is a relatively small virus. It's a single-stranded RNA positive sense virus. Essentially, in other words, its genome is messenger RNA. It's about the size of hepatitis A virus. It's tiny, but the key protein is the spike protein. That's the protein that emanates from the surface of the virus. That's the protein that's responsible for attaching the virus to cells. So if you can prevent the virus from attaching to cells, then you can prevent infection, which is why all of the immunization strategies are directed at trying to make antibodies against this SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. The right-hand side shows sort of a higher power magnification of that spike protein, which has two critical domains, the N-terminal domain and the receptor binding domain, which are the cell attachment domains. Okay, so there have been a number of strategies that have been used to make these vaccines. I'm going to talk about the two that have been used to make vaccines in this country, starting with messenger RNA vaccines. So how do they work? So the way this works, and this is a novel technology, is that you take a segment of messenger RNA, which in this case codes for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. You encapsulate it in a lipid nanoparticle, which is then injected intramuscularly. It's picked up by a number of cell types, but primarily dendritic cells, where it then enters the cytoplasm. It's uncoated, and so now the messenger RNA enters the ribosomal system, where then it is either put on the cell surface as a whole protein, excreted as a whole protein, or broken down into these small peptides, which are also put on the cell surface. Then what happens is that dendritic cell then travels, the APC just stands for antigen presenting cell, like a dendritic cell, travels to the local lymph node where it then stimulates B cells to make antibodies, stimulates helper T cells to help B cells make antibodies, stimulates cytotoxic T cells, which kill virus-infected cells. And it's a powerful immunogen. I think one of the ways you can tell that is that lymphadenopathy is not an uncommon occurrence associated with giving this vaccine. And that's not typical. I mean, we give a lot of vaccines in arms to children. Don't see a lot of lymphadenopathy. We did with the smallpox vaccine, which was another powerful immunogen, but it sort of speaks to the capacity of this virus to really stimulate the immune system. Okay, so we'll start with the first vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. This is a 30 microgram per dose, 2-dose vaccine separated by 3 weeks. It has a difficult safety and storage characteristic of having to be shipped and stored at -70 to -80 degrees centigrade, which basically means dry ice. And then it has only a life in the refrigerator of about 5 days. And then once you violate the rubber stopper, because it is a 5-dose multi-dose vial, you only have 6 hours to give all that dose B. And the reason for that is that these vaccines don't contain preservatives. Okay, the efficacy of this vaccine was remarkable. I mean, when I was on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, we were told that we should approve this if it was at least 50% effective with a lower bound of 30%. Dr. Fauci said he was optimistic that this vaccine could be as high as 70% effective, but in fact, it was 95% effective against all symptomatic illness, mild, moderate, or severe, as shown on this slide. That was true for all age groups. It was true for all racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it was true for all comorbidities. So this was remarkable, greater than anything anyone would have expected. Although remember, when we said that it was 95% effective in December 10th, when this was approved by our committee and ultimately by the FDA for use, we could say it was 95% effective for 3 months. That obviously was going to wane, and that's something we can talk about. Oops, sorry. Regarding safety, it did have a difficult safety profile, again, owing to the fact that it's a powerful immunogen. So the products of the immune system, like cytokines and chemokines associated with an activated immune system, can cause a variety of symptoms, including fever, fatigue, headache, chills, muscle pain, joint pain. Then this was a pretty common feature. It certainly happened to me. After my second dose of Pfizer vaccine, I had sort of fatigue and fever, which I treated successfully by constantly whining. That did work. I'm just throwing it out there if you guys want to use that. But the good news is the whining worked. It was gone by like day 3. So good. Okay, regarding the mRNA vaccines, the next mRNA vaccine, which is the Mrna Vaccine, this too is a 2-dose vaccine. And here, however, instead of it being 30 micrograms per dose, it was 100 micrograms per dose. It had easier shipping and storage characteristics in that it could be shipped and stored at freezer temperature. It had a longer refrigerator life of up to 30 days. It too was multi-dose, roughly 10 doses per vial. And it too only had a 6-hour life once you'd entered that vial, again, for the same reason. This too didn't contain a preservative. There's really no reason they couldn't have contained preservatives. It certainly would have made life a lot easier. It would have made life easier in terms of throwing away a lot of perfectly good vaccine, but that didn't happen. Okay, the efficacy was virtually identical to that seen for the Pfizer vaccine. It really was an independent confirmation of the Pfizer vaccine. And the mRNA vaccines aren't exactly the same. They are different molecules, and that hence the different dosing strategies. But again, this was excellent protection against any form of symptomatic illness. And this too was true across the board for all age groups, for all comorbidities. Remarkable. Safety profile was very similar, where associated with a second dose, you had, symptoms associated with a activated immune system, fatigue, headache, myalgia, arthralgia, etc. So the effectiveness of these vaccines once they were in the real world, because remember, when you do these studies in phase 3 trials, the study sites are very good about making sure that the shipping and storage and handling is exactly as required by the company. When it gets out into the real world, there's looseness there, and you wonder whether or not the effectiveness will be the same, especially because the mRNA basically is a labile molecule, and that hence the shipping and storage characteristics being the way they are. But this was a paper that came out a few months after these vaccines were approved through emergency use authorization, looking at the efficacy of both of these mRNA vaccines in preventing SARS-CoV-2 infection among healthcare personnel, frontline responders, and first responders. So there were about 4,000 people who received 1 or 2 doses of mRNA vaccines that were monitored with weekly PCR tests, and 2 doses of mRNA vaccines were about 90% effective at preventing symptomatic or asymptomatic disease, which is, again, excellent. These are more recent data showing that if you look at Canada, England, Scotland, that protection against severe illness is holding up. In Israel, protection against symptomatic disease or asymptomatic disease is not holding up as well. That is to be expected, actually. It's remarkable that protection against symptomatic disease, for the most part, is still holding up fairly well in this country, as is seen on, here. Here it's just another look at England, Scotland, Canada to show that protection is holding up with the Pfizer 2-dose vaccine, and this was both Pfizer and Moderna here on this one. But again, its protection is holding up against Delta. It's holding up unto the present day against severe disease, as you would expect, because the immunological mechanism by which you're protected against severe disease are memory cells. And memory B cells has been shown by people like John Weary at University of Pennsylvania or Shane Crotty at La Jolla are generated at high frequency following 2 doses of mRNA vaccine. And that has continued to hold up in this country through Delta and through all age groups and with both of the mRNA vaccines. So if the goal of this vaccine was to protect against serious illness, which Dr. Rochelle Walensky has consistently said is the goal, then this vaccine is continuing to meet that standard. Begging the question, why do we need booster dosing? But we'll get to that. Okay, in terms of safety post-approval, this was after the mRNA vaccines. This is a reports to the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System of myocarditis, seen primarily after dose 2 and primarily in younger people. That didn't prove that the vaccine caused myocarditis because there was no control group, but in order to determine whether it really was a cause of myocarditis, the Vaccine Safety Data Link could look at people who had or hadn't received that vaccine, looking at roughly 10 million doses that were out there, and finding that there was clearly an increased risk of this primarily after the second dose, primarily in boys and primarily in young people between 12 and 39 years of age. And this slide pretty much shows the same thing. So, you're talking about a rate of somewhere between 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 50,000. The rate is higher in younger people. So this is something we're going to be dealing with this vaccine. The good news about myocarditis the good news about myocarditis is generally it's short-lived, generally self-resolving, but not always. Okay, putting myocarditis in context, know that SARS-CoV-2 also causes myocarditis. This was a study out of the Big Ten looking at athletes who, about 1,600 athletes who between March 1st and December 15th developed COVID. And so what they did was they did gadolinium-enhanced MRI scanning on everybody, independent of whether they had cardiac symptoms, and found that there were the 2.3% or 37 of the athletes actually had evidence of myocarditis, which included 27 men and 10 women, again, a male predominance. And most of it was subclinical, but 9 had clinical myocarditis. So here, the chance then of developing myocarditis, clinical or subclinical, in healthy young people with COVID-19 was about 1 in 43, which is far greater than the 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 50,000 associated with myocarditis following vaccination. Also know that MIS-C, this multi-system inflammatory disease of children, also causes myocarditis commonly. I mean, this was a review of that, and you can see if you look 2 up from the bottom that 75% of these children who had MIS-C, this is a review of 15 case reports, had evidence of myocarditis. So MIS-C is a disease primarily the 6 to 14-year-old, average 9-year-old. Usually children are either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, often picked up just serendipitously because they were exposed to a friend or family member. And then a month later, no longer excreting virus, are antibody positive, and then have evidence of, fever, lung involvement, heart involvement, kidney involvement, liver involvement associated with this inflammatory disease associated with an immune response directed against the endothelial cells that line blood vessels. Okay, the other strategy used to make this vaccine is replication defective viral vectors. And this is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is Janssen is the wholly owned subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. So what they do here is they take a human adenovirus type 26, which is a relatively uncommon serotype. So therefore, most people don't have antibodies to this virus. And they take out the E1 gene, which then means that the virus can no longer reproduce itself. It is a replication defective adenovirus. They then insert into where the E1 gene was a transgene, which in this case is the gene that codes for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. In order to grow this vaccine up, they use a complementing cell line that actually provides that E1 gene so that the virus can reproduce itself. But the virus that is reproduced is replication incompetent. You should also note that the adenoviral vector that is used is a non-integrating vector, so it can't possibly integrate itself into DNA. Okay, this is a single-dose vaccine, which has relatively fairly straightforward storage and handling characteristics in the refrigerator, and also a 5-dose vial, and also one without preservatives. The efficacy here wasn't quite as robust as with the mRNA vaccines, at least within that first few month period. You're sort of at like the 70-75% range for protection against symptomatic disease. Much better, although the numbers are low here in terms of severe disease, as was seen also with the mRNA vaccines. In terms of side effects associated with this vaccine, it's in the sort of the same range of sort of fatigue, headache, myalgia, nausea associated with this vaccine as well. Safety post EUA approval, I think what was the surprise here was that these vectored virus vaccines, not only the J&J vaccine, but also the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a replication defective simian adenovirus, has this thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which is kind of sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? Because usually when you're thrombocytopenic, you bleed. You don't have thrombosis, but that was the unique combination of events seen here. And here, this occurred in roughly 1 per 500,000 people. I'll show you that in a minute. And unlike the previous phenomenon, which was myocarditis, which was primarily a male phenomenon, this was primarily a young woman phenomenon. Again, putting that in context, if you look at the bottom left, it says sort of 1.9 cases per million, so roughly 1 case per 500,000 for this kind of severe cases associated with clotting, specifically as you see in the upper left, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which was a complication of this vaccine clearly. You should note, however, that if you look at the second bullet point here from a slide produced by the CDC, that your risk of having even severe blood clots like cerebral venous sinus thrombosis is much higher actually with vaccination than with, much higher with natural infection than with vaccination. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is the same story. Sort of here, instead of it being 1 per 500,000 with the AstraZeneca vaccine, it was 1 per 250,000. But compare that to other known causes of severe clotting like birth control pills, smoking. Again, and for COVID infection, there's a 16% incidence of clotting, a smaller incidence of severe clotting. And the vectored virus vaccines were also a cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare sort of neurological syndrome associated with ascending paralysis. It occurred primarily in 1 per 120,000 people. And again, as was clear before, this is also a consequence of the natural virus. So there is no avoiding Guillain-Barré syndrome or myocarditis or clotting syndromes. If you believe, as a researcher at NIH said recently, that over the next few years, you're going to have 2 choices, which either get vaccinated or get natural infection, that you're much better off being vaccinated. This is just another another systematic review showing that Guillain-Barré syndrome was a manifestation of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And this was a study done by Barta and co-workers in Israel, and just with the yellow bars representing SARS-CoV-2 infection, the blue bars representing vaccination. But you can see sort of across the board, all of the things that have been reported following vaccination also were reported after SARS-CoV-2 infection, and generally at a higher rate. And this is what you see with viruses and vaccines. I mean, the oral polio vaccine is a rare cause of polio, roughly 1 per 2.4 cases, 1.1 case of polio, a vaccine-associated paralytic polio per 2.4 million doses. For measles, vaccine is also a rare cause of thrombocytopenia, roughly 1 per 30,000 doses, whereas measles is a much more common cause of thrombocytopenia transiently. The influenza vaccine can be a rare cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome, roughly 1 per million doses, but the virus itself causes Guillain-Barré syndrome in roughly 17 per million cases. So again, you could argue that giving the vaccine prevents Guillain-Barré syndrome. And the rotavirus vaccines, Rotatec and Rotarix, are rare causes of intussusception, sort of in the 1 in 66,000 dose range. But as we've basically replaced wild-type rotavirus with rotavirus vaccine viruses, that we have largely, if anything, seen the incidence of intussusception go down. Okay, so what is it going to take to stop this pandemic? There or said another way, what level of herd immunity is needed? So I'm going to define protective immunity as immunity that's induced either by disease or immunity that's induced by vaccination. So we'll start with disease. We list here that roughly 42, 43 million cases of coronavirus have been reported in this country, but that number's low. When you do antibody surveillance studies looking at sort of antibodies against the nucleoprotein, which enables you to distinguish who's been vaccinated from who's been naturally infected, that number is probably closer to 100 million people who've been naturally infected. And as is shown in this study, natural infection does protect against serious illness associated with exposure. This was a study of 52,000 healthcare workers in the Cleveland Clinic healthcare system between December 2020 and May 2021. Roughly 1,400 workers were infected, but not subsequently vaccinated. And what they found was that basically they were protected against severe disease. The only ones who weren't protected really were people who had not been either vaccinated or previously infected. And immunity induced by vaccination clearly protects. We've vaccinated about 59% of the population over 12, 61% over 18, 80% over 65. But you can see that there's a dramatic reduction in hospitalization and death associated with vaccination as compared to natural infection. I'm not sure how many times we need to learn this lesson, but it's clear that vaccination works. And then there is also the phenomenon of immunity induced by disease plus vaccination. This was a study done out of Kentucky showing that for people who were naturally infected and then vaccinated, as compared to people who were naturally infected but not vaccinated, those who were subsequently vaccinated had a little less than a 2.5-fold decreased risk of being reinfected, which then caused the CDC to state findings support the CDC recommendation that all eligible persons be offered COVID-19 vaccination regardless of previous SARS-CoV-2 infection status. So what's it going to take? If you take those two groups, people who are either vaccinated or naturally infected, or vaccinated and naturally infected, because they're overlapping groups, you find that there's, as least as of September 17th, about 382 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered. So about 54% of the population was fully vaccinated. Also, at least 100 million people have been naturally infected. Obviously, there's overlap, but I think you could reasonably argue that about 75% of the U.S. population is prevented or protected against severe disease because of either natural infection or immunization or both. Is that enough? Obviously, it's not enough because we're continuing to see a large number of cases, more than 100,000 cases, and more than, we're seeing more than an average. We're averaging like 2,000 deaths a day, which is just worse than we were last year. So if you're going to figure out what percent of the population needs to be protected, it really depends on two factors. One is the R0, or the contagiousness index. So the R0 is if I'm infected with SARS-CoV, if I have COVID-19, and I go about my normal day, and everybody I come in contact with is susceptible, then I'll affect, according to the most recent CDC data, somewhere between 5 and 9 people. That's a really high R0. You're in now the chickenpox range for contagiousness, and that's the Delta variant. The other piece of information you need is the effectiveness. Obviously, the more effective the vaccine is, the fewer people you need to vaccinate. The higher the R0, the more people you need to vaccinate. So those are the two factors. So there's actually a formula for this to determine the percentage of population that needs to be immune to effectively stop the spread of the virus. It's R0 minus 1 over R0 divided by the effectiveness of a vaccine to prevent contagiousness, really. So we'll give ourselves the best chance to have the lowest number possible. We'll pick the lowest of the range in R0 of 5, and we'll pick the sort of a vaccine effectiveness against contagiousness of 90%, which I think is generous. So R0 minus 1 over 0 then would be 5 minus 1 over 5, which is 0.8. If you divide that by 0.9, which is the percent of vaccine efficacy, then you would need to have at least about 90% of the population needs to be immune. Currently, it's I say 65% here. This is an older slide. I think it's probably closer to 75%. So I think we still need to vaccinate. I think the 80 million number is high here. I think we still need to vaccinate probably another 40 to 50 million people. And the sad part is they don't want to be vaccinated. So hence mandates. Okay, there are 3 obstacles to herd immunity. We'll go through them and then I'm done. The first is the variants. So the virus that raised its head in Wuhan was not the virus that left China. The virus that raised its head in Wuhan is called the ancestral strain. The virus that left China, that swept across Asia, swept across Europe, swept across the United States, killing hundreds of thousands of people, was the first variant. It was called. It doesn't have a Greek letter designation. It was called D614G. That was later, and I should point out, by the way, that the vaccines are made against that original ancestral strain, the so-called USA/Wu strain. That D614G strain was replaced by the next variant, which was the Alpha variant, because it was more contagious, several-fold more contagious. Then that was replaced by the Delta variant, which was also clearly more contagious. So we've had, although it may seem from watching the news that this virus mutates all the time, it's actually not a fast mutator. We've had sort of 3 mutations over a year and a half that have created variants of concern. This is nowhere near as mutable as a virus like flu, but it's certainly mutable enough. And now we see that Delta has taken over. I think on this slide, which is a little older, it says 94%. Now it's close to 98% of the strains that are circulating in the US are Delta. Okay, the obstacle number 2 is misinformation. Honey, come look, I found some information all the world's top scientists and doctors miss. I mean, this is the challenge of social media, where people can frankly look up the word or phrase COVID-19 vaccine and believe they know as much, if not more, than anyone who gives them information, independent of the level of expertise or experience of the person who's giving them that information. This was a brief film that was made by anti-vaccine activists that was released very early in the pandemic called Plandemic, which tells you what you need to know about what they believe was going on. And this was enormously popular. There were 8 million views of this particular movie when it first came out. It's since been taken off all sites on social media, but it had an impact. And what it claimed was that hydroxychloroquine cured COVID-19, that SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated to create a pandemic strain, that the influenza vaccine increases the chance of getting COVID-19, that influenza vaccine contains SARS-CoV-2, that microbes in the ocean cure COVID-19, that wearing a mask actually activates SARS-CoV-2. In fact, Louis Gohmert, who was a congressman from Texas, believed that he got COVID from wearing a mask, that Bill Gates created SARS-CoV-2 pandemic so that he could make money selling vaccines to prevent it, presuming that, $60 billion wasn't enough for him, and that COVID-19 death statistics have been manipulated to control the public. So it's all about government conspiracy. I mean, that's it. And I think when people basically resist this vaccine, that's what's at the heart of it. There was recently a Kaiser Family Foundation survey that asked people who haven't gotten the vaccine why. And 3 of 10 said because it's not approved, because it's not a licensed vaccine. It was just approved through emergency use authorization. So then it was licensed. I mean, a few weeks ago, it became a licensed product. And so what happened to the incidence of vaccine uptake? If you argue that roughly 65 million people haven't gotten the vaccine and 3 of 10 are saying they didn't get it because it was approved, and then it gets approved, then the rates of vaccination should have gone up dramatically. But they did. They actually went down a little bit, which tells you that was just an excuse. The other sort of misinformation pandemic themes are that the COVID vaccine alters your DNA, that it decreases fertility, that it harms pregnant women, that it makes you magnetic, which is my personal favorite, that the SARS-CoV protein, spike protein is toxic, and that according to VAERS, the COVID vaccines have killed thousands and thousands of people, all of which are untrue. But it's hard to talk people out of this. I mean, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, you can't use logic and reason to convince someone out of an argument that they didn't use logic and reason to get into. Okay, obstacle number 3 is claims to personal freedom, that it is my right, my choice, my body. It is my choice to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. I mean, I have a friend who called me the other day to tell me that her son-in-law had chosen not to get a vaccine. He proceeded to get COVID-19. He then proceeded to infect his wife, who was pregnant. Because she was pregnant and was at increased risk of severe disease, she was admitted to the hospital. Then she was admitted to the ICU. Then she was put on a ventilator. Then she delivered her baby severely prematurely, alive, but very premature. So the decision that he made for himself wasn't for himself. It was also for his wife and for his unborn child. I mean, people get this virus from people who are unvaccinated for the most part, and it's not your right. It's not your right as an American citizen to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. But that's not new. I mean, this is from 1885. It was from a little smallpox pamphlet. Again, the claim for personal liberty. It's my right, my body, my civil freedom. So what does personal liberty look like? Looks like this. Here was a healthcare worker who worked in a long-term care facility who, unvaccinated and with COVID, proceeded to infect 64 people in that facility and kill 5. So what else does civil liberties look like? Looks like this. This was a teacher at a Marin County, California school who was occasionally unmasked. She was infected with the Delta variant. She worked for 2 days and proceeded to infect 12 of the 24 kids in her classroom. You can see that from the picture there on the lower left, that there was no advantage to sitting there in those first 2 rows. See, once again, making a case for why it's good to sit in the back of the classroom. Okay, so that's it. This is our Vaccine Education Center at Chapter, where we try and answer all your COVID questions as well as other questions people have about vaccines. And thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Such great information, and I know we have lots of questions given current events. So Carolyn, would you like to start us off?
Yes, my question, Dr. Offit, when I got up this morning, I read that Dr. Walensky, head of the CDC, had, I guess you could say, overruled the ACIP vote for the booster of Pfizer for especially healthcare workers and other front lines. So my question's twofold. Number one, what do you think of the whole Pfizer booster situation? And secondly, do you agree with her interpretation of the booster needing to go to high-risk healthcare workers?
All right, so let me try and encapsulate this sad story because I think it is enormously confusing for people. I mean, you had President Biden standing up on September, saying that we are going to have a 3rd dose for the general population beginning on September 20th. I mean, thus bypassing the CDC, bypassing the FDA, and making people feel they were under-vaccinated. I mean, suddenly people who thought they were fully vaccinated weren't. So there were 2 statements that were made at the CDC meeting yesterday that I think were yesterday. What's today? Yeah, yesterday, that were critical. The first is the COVID working group said what we need to do is vaccinate the unvaccinated. I mean, if we're going to get on top of the pandemic, that's the problem. Certainly at our hospital and at the hospital next door, the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, which takes care of adults, when we see people in the ICU, it's not because they haven't had a third dose. It's because they haven't had any dose. That also, in combination with the fact that protection against severe disease has held up as you would have expected it to hold up. And so if the goal of this vaccine, as Dr. Walensky has stated many times, is to protect against serious illness, these vaccines are doing this. So what's the problem? And so I think it was important for the CDC yesterday to say, not only do we need to vaccinate the unvaccinated, but that if you are a member of the general population and you have received 2 doses, you are fully vaccinated, period. So that helped. I don't know if that message is going to get out there, but they did say that. Okay, so then they tried to figure out who, if anyone, should get a third dose. And so they started with people over 65 who are residents of long-term care facilities. That was an easy vote. That was a unanimous vote, 15-0, in favor of doing that, for the same reason that we offer a third dose for people who are immune compromised. I think when you get older, your immune system is less robust. A lot of things are less robust, but your immune system is one of them. And so what happens is that there that was an easy recommendation. The second recommendation, or the second policy they considered, was should they recommend a vaccine for people who are 50 to 64 years of age who have high-risk medical conditions. Now, again, I think that if they've gotten 2 doses, they probably are likely protected based on all the data we have so far against severe disease. But would there be an advantage to getting a third dose? And I think there they felt that the potential benefits of that outweighed any theoretical risks. And so that too was a unanimous vote, 15-0. So yes, let's give it to greater than 65-year-olds. Yes, let's give it to residents of long-term care facilities. Yes, let's give it to basically everybody over 50 who has a serious or a medical condition that puts them at risk of serious infection. Then it got trickier. The next policy to consider was those 18 to 49 years of age who have high-risk medical conditions. See, there they weren't so sure. And the reason is because the 18 is going down to 18. That's what they struggled with. The reason is that when Pfizer submitted its application for 3 doses, it was thin. I mean, it was basically 306 people. When they submitted their application for 2 doses, that was a 40,000 person phase 3 trial. Here, their application for 3 doses was 306 people. And they found 2 things. One is that the immune response, the neutralizing antibody response after dose 3 was much bigger than after dose 2. And lymphadenopathy, which occurred in 0.4% of people after dose 2, occurred in 5.2% of people after dose 3. So this is a more powerful immune response than that generated by dose 2, which generally is a good thing, unless you're worried about myocarditis, which clearly is a phenomenon of your immune response and a phenomenon of younger people. And so now they're struggling. They're thinking, do I want to give this vaccine down to 18 years of age to people who have high-risk medical conditions, knowing that they're also probably at greater risk of myocarditis with this 3rd dose? And so what they did was they punted to some extent. They said, with a vote of 9 in favor and 6 against, that you could give that, but that the person should make the decision in concert with their healthcare provider for the 18 to 49-year-old. Then they were asked about sort of a 4th policy. Should they make it this recommendation for anybody over 18 years of age who has an occupation or works in an institution where transmission is high? And there they voted no, by a vote of 9-6, no. They voted no because they didn't feel that the benefit of getting a vaccine if you're a young person outweighed and otherwise healthy and not at risk of serious disease, that the risks might outweigh the benefits. They wanted to test the water with 1 foot. They wanted to see what happens when I start, now that we've given this to 306 people in this country for the phase 3 trial that was supported by Pfizer. Let's see what happens. We start to give this to hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people. Let's wait a beat. And I think that was fair. Let's see what happens with that 3rd dose in people who are, say, at high risk, that are 18, 19, 20 years of age. But as of midnight last night, in a press release that came out at midnight last night, Dr. Rochelle Walensky overruled that and said that she is now going to say that anyone over 18 years of age who works in a position where they're going to be at high risk of transmission should get this vaccine, which basically just opened the door for everybody. I mean, certainly anybody, the Biden administration had wanted this to be a vaccine for the general public, and I think they just got this vaccine for the general public because there's no pharmacist in the world that's going to ask you whether you work in a grocery store or whether you're in healthcare. They're going to trust whatever you say. So I think I think this is all going to work out fine. What I would have liked to have seen is I would have liked to have seen the CDC do a modeling of what it's going to mean to give a third dose to people who've already had 2 doses in terms of changing the arc of this pandemic, because I'm going to guess not much. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that it does have an impact on the pandemic, because it certainly will have an impact on asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic disease. It will. But I still think that at the heart of this pandemic are people who are unvaccinated, and that's the issue. I mean, although I've had 2 doses of vaccine, if I got exposed to COVID and had mild or asymptomatic infection, I could shed virus, but I will shed less virus than people who haven't been vaccinated. And that's been shown by a study in Singapore that was much better than the study that was done here during that Provincetown outbreak. So I'm a little worried. I'm going to feel a lot better when the first few million doses are out there. I mean, Maurice Hilleman, who I consider to be the father of modern vaccines, and that he created, either did the primary research or development on 9 of the 14 vaccines we currently give to children. He was my hero in all of this. He said it best, quote, "I never breathed a sigh of relief until the first 3 million doses are out there," because you're not going to pick up rare adverse events pre-approval. And we'll see. I wish Dr. Walensky hadn't done that. I just wish we'd be a little more cautious about moving forward here.
Do you think she was bowing under political pressure?
I'm not a political analyst. I certainly don't think that the Biden administration has gotten what they've wanted.
Okay. Rebecca, do you have other questions for Dr. Offit?
I do. So you'll see the next question up here on the screen. This comes from John Rain. What do you think of the mix and match of mRNA third shots? What do you think of mRNA as a second dose for Johnson & Johnson recipients?
Right. So we need data. I think what one of the outcomes of yesterday's meeting is people who've gotten 1 dose of J&J vaccine or 2 doses of Mrna vaccines are somewhat out in the cold. We're still waiting for that. I do think that the Moderna 3-dose data is right around the corner, and my sense is that 3rd dose, the booster dose, is a lesser quantity of mRNA. It's not going to be the 100 micrograms, is my sense of this, but it'll be 50 micrograms. So wait. The people who have gotten 2 doses of Mrna vaccine should not get a 3rd dose with 100 micrograms, because I really think the 3rd dose could be 50 micrograms. So wait. In terms of mixing and matching, meaning if you've gotten 2 doses of Mrna vaccine, now you want to get a 3rd dose of say Pfizer vaccine. Again, I guess I would wait to see what the data are, because I think those data are being generated. The question about the Johnson & Johnson then getting a dose with Moderna, with an mRNA vaccine is a good one. There was just a paper that was published in September 9th this year, New England Journal of Medicine, looking at the AstraZeneca vaccine, the so-called ChAdOx1 vaccine, and in people who got that vaccine and then were boosted with that vaccine, as compared to people who got that vaccine that were then boosted with an mRNA vaccine. And that vaccine is similar to the J&J vaccine, in that they're both replication defective viral vectors. What they found in that study was pretty remarkable, which is that you actually were much better off getting a boost with an mRNA vaccine than you were getting a boost with a vectored virus vaccine. Much better off. I mean, the neutralizing titers were clearly higher, definitively higher. And more importantly, the breadth of protection, meaning protection against sort of variants of concern, was also much broader. So I do think that we're going to settle out on this, is that a booster dose of a vectored virus vaccine with an mRNA vaccine is going to be the way to go. But again, waiting for data.
All right. Thank you. Our next question relates to pregnant women, which I know in Virginia, as well as I'm sure across the country, we've had a number of questions related to recommendations for pregnant women. Can you share why some doctors are telling pregnant women the best time to get vaccinated is after they give birth and are breastfeeding?
Well, I think the best time for pregnant women to get vaccinated is when they're pregnant, because pregnant women are clearly at increased risk of being hospitalized, of going to the ICU, and of dying than women of the same age who are not pregnant. Pregnant women need to protect themselves. And the best way to do that is with vaccination. I mean, initially when this vaccine came out in December, that pregnant women hadn't been studied. There were only about 3 dozen instances of pregnancy in those, 30,000 and 44,000 person trials. So we didn't have really data. Normally what the CDC does in those circumstances, they'll say the vaccine is contraindicated for pregnant women because there was no data. They didn't do that, actually. What they said was, because they knew pregnant women were at greater risk, they said a pregnant woman could reasonably choose to get a vaccine, and tens of thousands did. And as a consequence, you had a lot of data on pregnant women who got vaccine as compared to pregnant women who didn't get vaccine, to see what the outcomes were in terms of maternal outcome or fetal and neonatal outcome. And there was the same. So there was no downside to getting the vaccine in terms of maternal or fetal outcome. And then the CDC changed their recommendations that a pregnant woman could consider to getting it, to a pregnant woman is recommended to get the vaccine during the pregnancy. So if there are doctors that are telling women not to get the vaccine during pregnancy, that is directly counter to the CDC recommendation, which is built on a tremendous amount of safety data. So bad idea.
Thanks for that clarification. Again, I know our outreach workers get so many questions about that. The next question relates to expiration. Do you have any information or guidance on giving a COVID-19 vaccine post-expiration date, specifically Johnson & Johnson 1 day post? Janssen has not released any guidance at this time.
Well, the companies aren't going to do that. The companies are going to tell you that if it's 1 day post expiration, that you shouldn't give it. I mean, they have to say that. I mean, do I think that after 1 day there's been a dramatic drop in potency or effectiveness of the vaccine? No, but you do jump without a net when you proceed to do that. So, I mean, it's one of those things where it becomes more of a legal issue than a medical issue. I mean, medically, do I think it's okay? Yeah, I think it's probably okay medically, but this is probably one of the most common questions I get asked. It's kind of an unanswerable question. You shouldn't try not to let things expire.
Thank you. All right, our next question should pop up here just a moment. A patient that has COVID waited the adequate time to get vaccinated with Pfizer. Only 1 dose has been received. Should they get the second? Patient does not want the second, but are they considered adequately vaccinated?
Right. I'm going to surprise you with this one. I think the answer is yes. I think they are adequately vaccinated. There are a handful of studies now which have shown that if you've been naturally infected, proven to be naturally infected, and then you get 1 dose of an mRNA-containing vaccine, your immune response after that 1 dose is very similar to what you get after a second dose of mRNA vaccine, assuming you were not naturally infected. I wish the CDC would catch up to those data and tell people if you've been naturally infected and you got 1 dose of mRNA vaccine, that's likely to be enough. But that's not the current recommendation. And if you're working in a place where there's a mandate for a vaccine, they're not going to accept that as adequate vaccination. It's too bad, because I do think that that's probably enough based on what are at least 4 studies at this point that have shown that. So I don't know why the CDC hasn't been clear on this.
Okay, thank you so much. That actually takes care of the questions in our chat. Carolyn, did you have any additional questions?
Just one thing as a pediatrician is the COVID-19, I guess, vaccine benefits released through breast milk? In other words, if the mother has been fully vaccinated, is the baby somewhat, I guess you could say, passively immunized if he's breastfeeding?
Well, so certainly there are antibodies that are passively transferred transplacentally. So immunoglobulin G would be transferred transplacentally, which would then benefit the baby for those first few months of life. The vaccine generally is very good at inducing immunoglobulin G, but not immunoglobulin A responses. So immunoglobulin A tends to be the immunoglobulin at mucosal surfaces. So you're not going to have as big of an IgA response, but there is some IgG in breast milk. The problem, and so it would be passively sort of on the sort of in the upper respiratory tract. It never gets absorbed. I mean, IgG doesn't get absorbed from the intestine, unlike, say, mice or cows that do that. We don't do that.
And the final question I know that all pediatricians want to know, well, do you believe the younger kids will get EUA approval to get vaccine with Pfizer, and when will that be? Can you, I guess, prophesize?
Okay, well, so my understanding from Pfizer is that, at least what they put out there, is that they plan to submit data on the 5 to 11-year-old, which are two-dose, again, a two-dose vaccine. This time, instead of being 30 micrograms a dose, it's 10 micrograms a dose, separated by 3 weeks, that they are going to submit those data by no later than the beginning of October. And I know that on the committee, we've been asked to set aside a number of dates in October. So I think that's likely, and I think we probably will consider this during October. So I would imagine that by Halloween, there would be a vaccine for the 5 to 11-year-old, assuming that we look at the data and are comforted by it. In terms of the 6-month to 5-year-old, I mean, there the dose is 3 micrograms. Again, 2 doses separated by 3 weeks. And according to Pfizer, they think they're going to have enough data to submit no later than the beginning of November and possibly the end of October. So again, it could be that by the new year, we could have a vaccine for children down to 6 months of age.
So it would mirror the flu vaccine then, as far as going down to 6 months.
Right.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, we do. Questions are filtering in. Okay. Questions are still filtering in. And like I said, still a hot topic, questions about recommendations for pregnant women. So this person is asking about a patient who is pregnant and was worried that the baby inside their body is worried about getting the vaccine because vaccine hasn't been approved for babies and young children. What is a good way to approach that train of thought for that patient?
Right. So the good news is there's an enormous amount of data that can answer this question. Tim Shimabukuro from the CDC has a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that looks at both maternal and neonatal outcomes, fetal outcomes, in women who are pregnant to get a vaccine as compared to women who are pregnant that don't get the vaccine. So the good news is we have data to answer this question. There are no differences in neonatal or fetal outcomes. So you can feel comfortable that those data are available. It shouldn't be hard to find. If Michelle can't find that article, just email me. But it's actually, I can probably tell you the article. Hold on a second. I think I have it up here. Don't go away. Here. Wait, don't go away. I can give you the article. Let's see. So 2, talks 5. Let's go to this one. Oops. Over here. Wait, got it. Okay, so it's Shimabukuro, Shimabakuro. It's New England Journal of Medicine, 2021, volume 384, pages 2273 to 2282. So his name again is Shimabukuro, Shimabakuro.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we can look at getting that article out in the follow-up email. All right. We have one more question. I think we still have time for at least one more. What do you think about us talking about providing boosters soon when other nations aren't able to get enough vaccines to provide the initial vaccination for their population?
I completely agree. I think it's awful. I do. I think that the impact of a third dose in this country will not be big. I hope I'm wrong. I hope certainly Dr. Fauci and others believe that there will be a big impact of this third dose. I hope that's true. But I have fear that it may not be so true because you're pretty much protected against severe disease after 2 doses. And although your R naught may change somewhat after the third dose, I just don't see it dramatically changing, but I hope I'm wrong. If that's true, we have 195 countries in this world, many of which have never given 1 dose of vaccine. If you don't believe that what happens in other countries can affect our country. Just look at what happened in China at the end of 2019. I mean, the Delta variant was first detected in India, the Alpha variant first detected in the UK. I mean, these variants are generated in the world and then come here. So it's not an altruistic act. But really, just giving vaccines in a world that needs vaccines is what we should be doing. So I don't like this. I don't. And when I can tell you that when we were asked to consider this at the FDA advisory committee meeting, we were specifically told not to talk about this. And I think that also was true at the ACIP meeting. They were told not to talk about that, which in some way makes sense because, I mean, who am I? I'm just a virologist and immunologist. I mean, I'm not someone who can make decisions about global health. But I do think that there should have been a panel that was put together to answer the question federally: is this an ethical thing to do? Because I think you could argue it's not.
Wonderful, thank you. That's certainly a challenging question. I know public health officials are grappling with. Well, Carolyn, those are all the questions that we had. So I will leave it to you to wrap it up.
All right, Dr. Offit, thank you so much. You're a hero, like you said, Dr. Hilleman is to you. You're a hero to many pediatricians and certainly my pediatric residents down here at Eastern Virginia Medical School. So we're even hoping to get you down here at some point. So hopefully you won't ignore another invitation from me. But thank you, sir, so much. And we appreciate you and keep up the good, hard work and go forth and heal, as they say when we graduate. All right. Thank you, Dr. Offit.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.